Hey everybody, this is writing micro lesson number 7 on utilizing metaphors for Honors 111 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. Okay, so what are metaphors? Well, you probably know this, but it makes sense to review it. Metaphors are just a form of figurative language. You remember the distinction between figurative versus literal language. And they are used as a literary device to compare one thing to another. So you see this example on your right-hand side. The student's mind is a bucket and the teacher pours in knowledge. That, I don't know if that's the most accurate metaphor for what the relationship between a teacher and a student is. I think I actually learn a lot from my students as well. But that's a common metaphor, right? The idea that students are containers for knowledge, and the professor, the faculty member, the teacher kind of fills them up with knowledge. That's an example, right? That's saying that here are two things, here is how they are like one another. Now when we use like or as, so if we were to rephrase this and say the student's mind is like a bucket that the teacher pours in knowledge, that would be called a simile. That's just a specific form of metaphor. But the basic idea is that metaphors are this figurative language that we use as a device to compare things. So why do we do that? And how can metaphors enrich and improve argumentative writing? Usually when you see metaphors, they happen a lot in poetry. Oftentimes, poetry will heavily use metaphors. You see them a lot in creative writing. You might not see them quite so much in argumentative writing or analytical writing, but I think they have an important role to play here as well. So what can they do in this particular form of writing? A couple key things. One is that they can sustain reader interest. So literal language and literal analysis can become boring or dry, even if we're using, really interesting verbs and we're altering the structure of our sentences. But the idea is that figurative language and making these sorts of comparisons just opens up way more possibilities than if you stick to strictly literal language. And that will sustain your reader's interest. If you're diving in to talk about these interesting comparisons, that can sustain your reader's interest. I actually teach a course on George Orwell, the writer George Orwell, who most people know from 1984 and Animal Farm. And we were going back and we were reading some of his early work, some things that most people haven't read. And there was a book called Burmese Days. And some of the metaphors that he uses in this book, Burmese Days, which is about the British colonial presence in Burma, are so vivid and capture the reader's interest so much that the first time I went back and read this book again, I hadn't read it for probably about a decade, I could remember specific metaphors that Orwell used, usually to discuss violence or something terrible, but I could remember those metaphors. That's how much they were able to capture my interest and kind of imprint Orwell's metaphors on my brain. So they can sustain reader interest, but they can also do the next thing, which is make your argument more memorable. If you use a really powerful metaphor to describe something, your reader is more inclined to remember the point, right? So it can be a device to just kind of make your reader remember what you're talking about. And then lastly, number 3, they can clarify concepts. So some things, some ideas, some processes, some phenomena are going to be so complex that if you simply try to describe them literally to someone who doesn't have a fair degree of specialized knowledge, or maybe they're not familiar with the text or the thing that you're referring to, they're not going to be able to get it unless you can find some sort of common ground. And so you see this a lot in kind of like popular science writing, or I'm a social scientist, and sometimes we'll use concepts if we're talking to a general audience about some social phenomena. We'll say this is like X, Y, or Z, something that we know the reader is familiar with, and then those complex concepts become easier to understand because you have some sort of common ground. So they can help to clarify ideas, concepts, phenomena by referring to something that's a little bit more familiar. Okay, so what are some of the guidelines for when and how to use metaphors in your writing? Let's start with the don'ts of metaphors. Metaphors are dangerous. Metaphors can overwhelm writing. Metaphors can be used kind of sloppily or irresponsibly. So the first thing to note is use metaphors sparingly and intentionally. Don't just kind of pepper your writing with metaphors willy-nilly, but really think about when you're using metaphors and try to do so in a way where there's a point where you really want the reader to remember it, or there's something that's so complex that the only way you're going to be able to get it across to your reader is using a metaphor. And use them in those instances, but don't just use them for the sake of using them. Also, utilize metaphors that fit your narrative voice and are appropriate to the subject matter. So you want to utilize metaphors. You all have a voice in your writing, right? And so you want to use something that kind of aligns with the way that you speak, the way that you phrase things in your writing, and also a metaphor that's appropriate. And here I'm thinking mainly of you don't want to compare a phenomena or something to something which would trivialize it or would make you seem insensitive, right? So I sometimes see students that talk about things like, conflict or warfare or genocide, and they use metaphors to describe those things, and the metaphors actually make them sound like they're really, really insensitive, right? So Civil War is not like a football game, right? And when you use those sorts of metaphors, it can just rub the reader the wrong way, and it can make it seem like you're insensitive and kind of not grasping the seriousness of the subject matter. So there's plenty of instances in which you have to be really careful about what kind of metaphor you use and whether or not it's appropriate. The third thing I would note is that metaphors always simplify. And you want to be careful not to use metaphors that simplify the argument so dramatically that the reader might take you less seriously, right? So if you're talking about, world leaders or something, and you're comparing it to your little brother and your little sister wrestling over a toy, right? There's probably some element of kind of competition that's shared there, but you don't want to simplify complex social, political, scientific phenomena to the point in which it makes it seem like you're not, the writing isn't as serious as it should be. And then lastly, you want to avoid cliches or mixed metaphors. So cliches, there are all sorts of just overused metaphors. You can actually find websites that just have big, long lists of metaphors that are very, very common that you should probably avoid. The writer I mentioned earlier, George Orwell, had a list of rules for writing politically, writing political essays and political works. And one of the things that he said is you should try to avoid metaphors that you've heard before. And he had a whole list of metaphors that are commonly used in political writing, and said don't use those things. That's lazy. Create your own metaphors. Dip into your knowledge of the English language and find your own. But I printed off one of these lists of overused metaphors, and there's a ton of them that have become so overused that we don't even think about what they mean anymore. So for instance, a loose cannon, or armed to the teeth, or an axe to grind. Those sorts of metaphors show up all the time. And the thing is with an overused metaphor that there originally was a reference to an actual thing that would happen. Like a loose cannon, I'm pretty sure, refers to a cannon on the deck of a ship that was not properly secured, and so when it was fired, it would kind of roll around the deck and potentially hurt people. But we use that term so frequently now that it actually doesn't relate back to the original thing that term described. So maybe that's not the most effective metaphor. The other thing that you have to worry about is mixed metaphors. And I provided an example here. I found another website that just had a list of really egregious mixed metaphors. This is one from MSNBC. He says, "That's awfully thin gruel for the right wing to hang their hats on." So thin gruel refers to kind of, weakness. It's a weak position, or it's a weak plank, a weak platform. But we also have a metaphor that talks about, hanging your hat on something, and it's essentially kind of like, what is your what is your foundation? What is your core bargaining point? But when you mix them together, it just becomes nonsense, right? Thin gruel and hats have nothing to do with one another. And it's one of the dangers of the overuse of metaphors. So be mindful of that. Be mindful of, these egregious mixed metaphors that can show up. All right, so how do you effectively utilize metaphors? And these will be the criteria that I'll use this week for looking at your weekly writing assignments. So basically ask yourself 3 questions. 1, is the metaphor accurate? So does the metaphor actually enhance the reader's understanding of an idea or a concept by drawing comparison to something that's similar in form or function? So one of the reasons why we avoid overused metaphors is that they don't actually refer back to anything anymore. They've become used as metaphors, but the reader probably isn't familiar with the original referent of the metaphor, so it might not be very effective as a metaphor. So think about whether or not the comparisons that you're making are appropriate and they're accurate. The thing that you're comparing, whatever the phenomena is to, is actually similar in form or its function. Is the metaphor vivid and appropriate? So does the metaphor avoid cliche? Is it, rich and engaging and kind of interesting? And is the tone or type of metaphor appropriate to the thing being discussed? So if you're talking about, Civil War, don't be talking about football. Or if you're talking about, whatever it might be, environmental destruction, don't be talking about, the water spilling out of the pool when somebody jumps in it. Or just try to capture the seriousness and the somber tone of things that you're writing about. Or if you're writing about something more fun, then you don't introduce, really dark and disturbing metaphors that don't align with what you're talking about. So is it appropriate to the tone and the subject matter? And then lastly, is the metaphor appropriately integrated into the body of the essay? So does it cohere well with the rest of the essay? Does the writer utilize transitional language to set up the metaphor? So a metaphor is always going to be kind of an interjection into the writing. And it's going to be, potentially a little bit of a digression in which you take a step back and you make this comparison for the purposes of making something clearer or making something more memorable. And do you do that in such a way that you're utilizing transitional language and it's clear to your reader what exactly is happening here? Okay. So that's those will be the criteria that I look at. Is it accurate? Is the metaphor kind of good at drawing a comparison to something that's actually similar? Is it vivid and appropriate in tone? And is it appropriately integrated, utilizing transitional language into the body of the essay? Or does it stick out like a sore thumb? That's not what we want. Okay? So there are plenty of examples of utilizing metaphors. I'd encourage you, as you start to think about metaphors more intentionally, to just look for them in writing generally. But here I presented, potentially kind of a ridiculous metaphor, but one of my own creation. So this is an example that we can talk about. Here's the thesis statement of the essay. You can imagine this as a short essay or a slightly longer essay, and it refers to a text that we've read in Honors 111. The thesis is: the Odyssey presents a cultural portrait of Greek society and its core values, perhaps the most important of which was xenia or hospitality. And that was actually one of the questions in your prompts a few weeks ago when we read the Odyssey. So this would be one potential kind of thesis statement. And here's an example of utilizing metaphors. So here's what we got. It might not be the best. It's what I could come up with quickly. Cultural norms and values can operate as a kind of employee handbook for society as a whole. They lay out general expectations for how one behaves in different settings and what is culturally appropriate. Minor transgressions may be cast aside or go unnoticed, but major violations of these expectations invariably have severe consequences. The suitors in the Odyssey are in flagrant violation of the most fundamental and important cultural norms of ancient Greek society. Throughout the story, we gain the sense that there will be repercussions for their actions, right? So the comparison there is between cultural norms and values and an employee handbook, right? I don't know, maybe not appropriate given that we're talking about the Odyssey, one of the most important texts in Western civilization. But hopefully it gives you a sense of the important role that cultural norms and values can play, and they guide our lives in the same way that the expectations that we have with regard to, what we wear at the workplace, how we interact with our fellow employees, et cetera, all the things that are laid out in Employee Handbook. Well, on a much broader and more macro level, cultural norms play that role as well. So that's an example of a metaphor. I don't know if it's the best one, but that gives you at least a sense of how you could be integrating metaphors into your writing. And there are some resources for this as well. There's the Purdue Online Writing Lab. This resource specifically, I think, is geared more towards creative writing, but some of their general suggestions and advice, I think, carry over to argumentative and analytical writing. And then the Macmillan Dictionary also just has a list of famous metaphors. Now, what I would say here is you don't want to use super famous metaphors unless you're doing so, intentionally. But it just gives you a sense of some of the ways in which great writers have crafted metaphors that are so powerful that some of these are hundreds of years old. The one I always see referenced in discussion of metaphor is Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage. And that's from his play, As You Like It. And that's hundreds of years old, but you see all sorts of references to All the World's a Stage. And that gives you a sense of a powerful metaphor can really just kind of endure across generations even. So something to aspire to, I guess. So we'll wrap up there. I am looking forward to your writing this week and your utilization of metaphors. So thanks very much.